She never expected a routine restoration project to reveal a hidden chapter of history. When Riley Monroe started restoring the World War II fighter plane, she thought she was just bringing an old relic back to life. But what she uncovered inside the cockpit wasn't just rusted metal. It was a forgotten story that would change everything. The deeper she dug, the more she discovered about the man who once flew this plane. And the truth behind his sacrifice left her in tears. Before we dive into this incredible journey, let us know where you're watching from. If stories like this move you, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode takes us even deeper into the past. Now, let's get started. Riley Monroe had always found solace in the hum of engines and the scent of motor oil. Growing up surrounded by cars, bikes, and engines, she had inherited her father's love for mechanical work. But restoring a fighter plane was a new challenge, and one that sparked an excitement she hadn't felt in years. It was an old, rusted relic, sitting abandoned in the corner of a forgotten airstrip, a World War II-era fighter. Its once vibrant yellow paint, now dulled and chipped, was surrounded by overgrown weeds and untended grass. The barn behind it had seen better days, the tin roof sagging under years of neglect. Riley had stumbled upon it by chance, an old advertisement in a local paper offering planes for sale that hadn't flown in decades. The price was dirt cheap. It wasn't often you came across an entire fighter jet, and Riley knew it was a project worth undertaking. She stood there, eyeing the plane from the ground, hands on her hips. The wings looked like they'd been twisted in battle, the fuselage dented and scratched with history. This wasn't just a piece of machinery, this was a story, one she was determined to uncover. She'd been given the task of restoring it to its former glory. The owner had hoped for an easy fix, but Riley had a different plan. She wasn't just going to make it fly again. She was going to breathe life into the legacy it carried with it. The first step was simple enough: assessing the damage. As she walked around the plane, she couldn't help but admire the craftsmanship of the cockpit, still intact despite the years of weathering. The details were clear, even under layers of grime. A carefully placed insignia on the side, a patch of fading numbers on the nose. Everything spoke to its history, even in its dilapidated state. As she climbed into the cockpit for the first time, Riley's hand brushed against something that didn't belong. It was tucked under the seat, something small, hidden, a metal box. Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure why, but she felt compelled to open it. The hinges creaked as she pulled it open, revealing a bundle of old letters tied together with a string. They were worn, their edges frayed from years of being hidden away. Riley carefully untied the bundle, the dust falling from the pages like forgotten memories. One letter was different from the rest. It was dated June 1944 and addressed to a woman named Eleanor. The letter's contents were heartfelt, detailing the pilot's journey through training, his hopes, and fears as he prepared to leave for war. But it was the last line that caught Riley's breath. "I'll be back, Eleanor. I'll make it through this, and we'll build the life we dreamed of together." The words hit her harder than expected. Who was this man? What had happened to him? And why was this letter left here, in the cockpit, all these years later? This was just the beginning, and Riley knew it. The more she read, the more she felt like she was uncovering a piece of history that had been lost. The fighter plane wasn't just a machine to restore, it was a vessel for a forgotten love story, and a promise that, against all odds, would eventually be fulfilled. The discovery of the letter left Riley with more questions than answers. She carefully folded the pages back into the box, as though the words within might hold the key to unraveling the mystery of the plane's past. The letter had been hidden away for decades. But who had it belonged to? And more importantly, what had happened to the man who had written it? Riley spent the next few days working on the plane, trying to balance her repair work with the overwhelming curiosity gnawing at her. Every time she crawled into the cockpit to inspect the controls or tighten a bolt, she found herself glancing at the bundle of letters tucked carefully in her bag. She couldn't help but imagine the young man, perhaps no older than 20, writing the words to Eleanor, his sweetheart back home, promising he'd return. The thought of that promise lingered in her mind, urging her to find out more. Her first step was to dig deeper into the history of the plane itself. The faded insignia on its wing had caught her attention, and after a bit of research, Riley found that the fighter had been part of the 15th Air Force during World War II. The more she read, the more she realized how much the plane had been through. It had fought in several key battles in Europe, enduring more than a few close calls. But what about its pilot? Riley called up the local aviation museum to see if they had any records on the plane's service history. After explaining what she had found, the curator, a man named Tom, was intrigued. He promised to check their archives and get back to her. While she waited for a response, Riley decided to visit the airstrip where she'd found the plane. She needed to see if there were any other clues that could lead her to the pilot. The airstrip was as quiet as ever, but something had changed for Riley. She walked the familiar grounds with a new sense of purpose, scanning every corner as though the dirt and rust might reveal something hidden beneath the surface. That's when she noticed a small plaque, almost invisible against the overgrowth by one of the old hangars. It was worn, but Riley could still make out the words etched on it. In honor of Captain George Harris, a true American hero. Her heart skipped a beat. Was this the same man who had written the letter? The name rang a bell, but she wasn't sure why. She'd seen names like this before on monuments, in history books, but they were always just names. Now, it felt different. This was personal. She had to know more. With renewed determination, Riley tracked down the airstrip's old owner, a man named Bill, who had run the airstrip during the war. Bill was now in his late 80s, but when Riley approached him with her questions, his eyes twinkled with recognition. "George Harris?" Bill said, his voice thick with memory. "I remember that boy. Strong as an ox and twice as stubborn. Flew that plane like he was born to be in the sky. He was the kind of guy who made everyone around him feel like they could do anything. A real hero. But he never made it back, you know." The words hit Riley like a punch to the gut. The man who had written that letter, who had made such a heartfelt promise to Eleanor, never came home. The story she had uncovered was more tragic than she could have ever imagined. Bill's eyes softened as he continued. "After his last mission, we found the wreckage in the hills. No one ever knew what happened to the body, though. Some say it was lost in the crash. Others say it was taken by enemy forces. But Eleanor, she never gave up. She believed, right up until the end, that George would come back. That plane was a symbol of his promise." Riley was speechless. The weight of the words lingered in the air, thick with the sorrow and hope that had carried this story through the years. Captain George Harris had been a hero, and his love for Eleanor had been the anchor that held him steady through the chaos of war. Yet, in the end, his promise had gone unfulfilled. Now, standing in the shadow of his plane, Riley knew what she had to do. This plane wasn't just a historical artifact. It was a tribute to love, loss, and the unbreakable bonds that war had torn apart. And somehow, it had found its way into her hands. She had a duty to finish what had been started, not just to restore the plane, but to honor the man who had flown it. Riley wiped the sweat from her brow, her heart heavy with the knowledge she had uncovered. But there was one more thing to do. One last piece of the puzzle remained. She needed to find Eleanor, the woman who had waited, who had believed. And when she did, Riley knew the full story would finally be revealed. The search for Eleanor was a journey in itself. Riley's mind raced with thoughts of the letters she had read, those words, written decades ago, full of love and hope. But she had to know more about the woman who had been the recipient of such a heartfelt promise. What had happened to her after George disappeared? Did she ever move on? Or did she carry that hope with her until the end? Riley spent hours at the local library, combing through old records, newspapers, and any documents she could find about Captain George Harris. She finally came across an obituary for Eleanor Harris, published in the 1972nd. The article mentioned that she had never married after George's death, a fact that seemed to confirm Riley's suspicions. Eleanor had never given up on the love she had shared with the young pilot. From the obituary, Riley learned that Eleanor had spent the last years of her life in a small town nearby. She had never remarried, and had quietly lived out her days in the same house where she and George had planned their future together. The article mentioned that she had passed away a few years ago, but there was no mention of family or survivors. Riley's heart sank. She had missed her chance to meet the woman who had carried George's memory for so long, but something told her that this story wasn't over yet. Riley knew that Eleanor's legacy had to live on in some way. She just had to find it. A week later, Riley drove to the small town, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what she might find. The house where Eleanor had lived was modest, a little two-story home tucked into a quiet neighborhood. The front yard was overgrown with wildflowers, and there was a small bench on the porch, as if waiting for someone to sit and watch the world go by. Riley hesitated before knocking on the door. She wasn't sure what she would say, or how she would explain the connection she had with Eleanor and George. But as she raised her hand to knock, the door opened, and an elderly woman stood there, her hair silver, her face lined with years of laughter and tears. "Can I help you, dear?" The woman's voice was soft but steady, the kind of voice that instantly put you at ease. "I'm sorry to bother you," Riley began, unsure of how to proceed. "My name is Riley Monroe, and I've been restoring a World War II fighter plane. It belonged to a man named George Harris. I believe you may have known him." The woman's face changed instantly, her expression softening as she stepped back to invite Riley inside. "George." She whispered the name like it was a prayer, her eyes distant as she motioned for Riley to sit. "Please, come in. I knew George very well." Riley took a seat at the kitchen table, where the scent of fresh coffee lingered in the air. The room was cozy, decorated with old photos of a younger Eleanor and a man in a military uniform. One of the photos caught Riley's eye. It was a black and white image of George, standing proudly in front of the same fighter plane Riley was restoring. The resemblance was undeniable. It was him, the young pilot, full of life and hope. "George was the love of my life," Eleanor said, her voice cracking slightly. "I never thought he wouldn't come back. I always believed he would walk through that door again, just like he promised." Riley listened in silence as Eleanor shared her memories, her words filled with love and longing. The years had softened her grief, but it was clear that the love she had for George had never faded. She spoke about the day he left for war, about the letters they exchanged, and how she had always kept the hope that one day he would return to her. "I held on to that promise for as long as I could," Eleanor continued. "Even when the letters stopped coming, I never gave up hope. I kept the plane in my heart, hoping that one day someone would bring it back to life. I knew George would want that." Riley's heart swelled with emotion as she sat there, listening to the woman who had carried the weight of her love and her loss for so many years. The pain of waiting had been a constant presence in Eleanor's life, but so had the love that had inspired her to keep holding on. "I found something when I was working on the plane," Riley said softly, reaching into her bag and pulling out the bundle of letters. She handed them to Eleanor, who took them with trembling hands. Eleanor's eyes welled up with tears as she read through the letters, her fingers tracing the words George had written to her all those years ago. She paused on the last letter, the one Riley had found in the cockpit, and let out a soft, bittersweet laugh. "He never did come back, did he?" Eleanor whispered, her voice filled with sorrow, but also peace. "But I always knew he was out there, flying high, keeping his promise." The room fell into a heavy silence as both women sat with their own thoughts. Riley had uncovered a story that wasn't just about an old plane or a long-lost pilot. It was about a love that had survived beyond time, beyond war, and beyond death. Eleanor handed the letters back to Riley, her hands gentle but firm. "Thank you, dear," she said softly, "for bringing this piece of him back to me. I never thought I'd see it again." Riley stood up, her heart full as she looked at the older woman who had carried George's memory for so long. "It's not over yet," she said, her voice steady. "I'm going to finish what he started. I'm going to make sure that plane flies again for him, for you, for all of us." Eleanor smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I know you will, Riley. I know you will." Riley's work on the fighter plane took on new meaning now. Each wrench she turned, each bolt she tightened, felt like more than just a mechanical fix. It was a tribute. She wasn't just restoring a plane. She was bringing back the past, fulfilling a promise made between two people separated by war, time, and loss. It wasn't just about the steel and the paint. It was about the history that lingered within the plane's frame, the life it had once carried, and the legacy it still held. Every day she worked, Riley found herself thinking more about George and Eleanor. The plane had always been a machine to her, something she could fix and bring back to life. But now, it was more than that. It was the physical manifestation of love, a love that had never been fully realized, and a promise that had never been broken. She spent long hours on the aircraft, carefully restoring its body and engines. The fuselage was twisted from years of exposure, and the wings had taken their toll in battle. But Riley knew how to fix things. She knew how to breathe life into broken parts. With each piece she restored, she imagined George's hands working on it, tuning it to perfection. She could almost hear his voice in the quiet hum of the engines. One late evening, as the sun began to set and the soft glow of orange filtered through the hangar, Riley found herself in the cockpit once again. This time, however, it wasn't just a project. She didn't see rust and cracks. She saw potential. She could almost feel the ghost of the man who had once flown this plane, soaring through the skies, facing impossible odds, and making the ultimate sacrifice. Riley carefully cleaned the dashboard, removing the years of grime that had built up. As she worked, something shiny caught her eye. Beneath the dusty console, there was a small compartment she hadn't noticed before. She carefully pried it open, her heart racing with anticipation. Inside was an old, weathered map. It was folded and tattered, as though it had been carried in someone's pocket for years. She unrolled it slowly, her hands trembling. It was a map of Europe, but there were markings on it, red crosses, lines drawn from one place to another, and notes scribbled along the edges. Riley studied the map for a long time, trying to decipher its meaning. Then it hit her. This map wasn't just a flight path. It was George's map, the one he had used during his missions, the one that had guided him through the skies. It was a tangible piece of his history, a map of places he had flown, places he had fought for, and places he had loved. Her heart pounded as she realized what she had found. This wasn't just a relic from the past. It was a testament to everything George had been: a fighter, a hero, and a man of conviction. And now, it was in her hands. Riley gently folded the map and placed it carefully in her bag. This was another piece of the puzzle, another clue in the story that had been buried for so long. She knew she had to take it back to Eleanor. The next day, Riley made the drive to the small house once again. She had hoped to tell Eleanor the good news, that the plane was nearly finished, that George's legacy was about to soar again. But now, with the map in her hands, she felt an even deeper connection to the man and his story. She wasn't just restoring the plane anymore. She was preserving the memories of the man who had lived, loved, and fought. Eleanor greeted Riley with a warm smile when she arrived. Her eyes lit up when Riley told her how close the plane was to being finished. "You've done it, haven't you?" Eleanor said softly. "You've brought him home." Riley nodded, her voice catching in her throat. "I'm almost there. The plane will be ready soon. But there's something else. Something I think you'll want to see." Eleanor's eyes sparkled with curiosity as Riley handed her the worn map. She unfolded it slowly, her fingers tracing the red markings. "This was his," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I remember this map. He kept it in his jacket pocket. He always knew exactly where he was going, where he needed to be. He was so focused, so determined." Eleanor's hands shook as she looked at the map, as though she could feel George's presence once again. "I used to ask him about his missions, about where he'd been. He never told me everything. But I knew he was scared. I knew it. But he always said he'd come back to me, He kept that promise in his heart, even when he was in the sky, even when the world around him was falling apart. Riley watched quietly, feeling the weight of the moment. She had always believed that her work was about fixing things. But now, she realized it was about something much bigger, about connecting the past to the present, about ensuring that the stories of heroes like George would never be forgotten. "I'll finish the restoration," Riley said, her voice firm with resolve. "But this map, these letters, they're part of the plane now. They're part of the story, and I want you to have them. This is your legacy too, Eleanor. You kept that promise just as much as he did." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes as she held the map to her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for bringing him back to me." For the first time in months, Riley felt a sense of peace. She had not only restored a piece of history, she had reunited two souls separated by time and war. And the plane, that once forgotten relic of the past, was now a symbol of something much deeper. It was a story of love, loss, and hope, reborn. The final stages of restoration felt like the most significant ones. Riley had spent countless hours working on the plane, but now it was more than just a project to her. It had become a mission. She was so close to completing the restoration, and yet there was still a sense of reverence, a quiet understanding that something special was unfolding. The fighter plane stood in the hangar, its body gleaming in the soft light of the early morning. The yellow paint, which had once been faded and chipped, was now vibrant and crisp. The cockpit had been meticulously cleaned, and the engine, once frozen and immobile, now purred with life as Riley carefully tested it. It wasn't just a mechanical victory, it was an emotional one as well. As she worked, Riley thought back on everything she had learned about George and Eleanor. The map she had found in the cockpit was now framed in her shop, a reminder of the journey that had brought her here. The letters, the stories, the legacy, it all felt like it was embedded in the very fabric of the plane. But Riley knew there was one more thing she needed to do before the plane could be considered fully restored. It wasn't just about making it look perfect. It had to have soul. It had to carry the essence of what George had left behind. She had a plan, a personal touch. Riley spent hours searching through old aviation records, looking for the exact design and insignia George's squadron had used during the war. She wanted to make sure the plane wasn't just restored to perfection but was also historically accurate, carrying the same markings it had worn all those years ago. After some digging, she found the exact emblem and began carefully painting it onto the nose of the aircraft, just as George had once done before flying into battle. It was a symbol of courage, a symbol of sacrifice, and now it would be part of her restoration. The final touch was adding a small plaque inside the cockpit. It wasn't much, but it meant everything. Riley had the words engraved herself, carefully choosing the phrase that captured the essence of the story she had uncovered. The plaque read, "To Captain George Harris, whose promise never faded. Your legacy lives on in the skies you once flew." She placed the plaque on the cockpit dashboard, just below where George's hands would have rested. It was a small, quiet tribute, but Riley knew it was the right one. This wasn't just about honoring George as a pilot. It was about honoring him as a man, a son, a lover, and a hero. The plane was ready. Every part of it, from the wings to the engine, had been restored to perfection. But it wasn't the polished exterior that made it special. It was the history it carried, the lives that had touched it, the love that had been passed along through the years, and the promise that had never been broken. Riley stood back and surveyed her work. The plane, now fully restored, gleamed in the sunlight streaming through the hangar door. It looked as though it could take flight at any moment. The colors were bright, the engine hummed, and the insignia on the nose was a beacon of the past, a reminder of what had been. But something still lingered. She hadn't finished the restoration alone after all. This plane wasn't just a symbol of George's promise. It was a testament to the connection Riley had formed with Eleanor, with the history, and with the spirit of those who had fought for their country. Riley wasn't just standing in front of a plane. She was standing in front of a legacy. The legacy of George, of love, of war, of sacrifice. and it was time to honor it. The next day, she would fly it. The day had finally come. The fighter plane stood on the runway, gleaming under the bright afternoon sun, its polished metal reflecting the sky above. Riley had worked tirelessly for weeks, and now the plane was ready for its first flight since it had been grounded all those years ago. This wasn't just any test flight. It was a tribute. A celebration of George's legacy, of the love that had sustained him, and of the promise that had survived the decades. Riley stood at the edge of the runway, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent so much time in the cockpit, repairing, restoring, and connecting with the plane, but now it was time for the real test. She was about to bring it back to life in the way it was meant to be. As she adjusted her flight suit and climbed into the cockpit, Riley couldn't help but think of George and Eleanor. She could almost hear their voices in the back of her mind, the love they shared, the sacrifice, the promise of a return that never came to be. Her hands gripped the controls, the metal smooth and familiar under her touch. She took a deep breath, calming her nerves. The engine roared to life, a sound that felt like music to her ears. Riley checked her instruments, then looked out at the runway one last time. There was no turning back now. As the plane slowly began to roll forward, Riley felt the weight of history pressing in on her. Every foot of the runway felt like it was carrying the stories of all those who had come before her, of George, of Eleanor, and of every soldier who had ever stepped into the cockpit of a plane like this. The plane lifted off the ground with a smooth grace, soaring into the sky as though it had never been grounded in the first place. Riley's heart raced as she climbed higher, the ground below becoming a distant memory. The wind rushed through the cockpit, and the roar of the engine filled her ears. It was a feeling of freedom, a feeling of triumph, but as she reached the clouds, something deep within her shifted. She wasn't just flying a restored plane anymore. She was flying George's plane. She was flying the embodiment of his promise, his legacy. And for a moment, it felt as though he was sitting beside her, guiding her through the sky. Riley pulled the plane into a wide loop, the engine purring like a living creature beneath her. She could see the world unfolding below, the mountains and fields stretching out like a canvas, waiting to be painted with the stories of those who had come before her. As she leveled out, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. The journey she had taken with this plane, the research, the restoration, the discovery of George's story, had changed her in ways she couldn't fully explain. She had started out as just a mechanic, a woman with a passion for engines. But now, she was part of something much bigger. She was part of a legacy that stretched back through time, through the lives of those who had sacrificed everything. And in that moment, as she flew through the sky, Riley knew that she had completed the circle. The plane wasn't just a machine. It was a symbol of perseverance, of love, of memory, and of hope. And it was a story that would live on long after she had landed. With a final sweeping turn, Riley guided the plane back toward the runway. As she touched down, the wheels kissed the earth with a soft thud, and the plane rolled to a stop. She sat in the cockpit for a moment, the engine ticking softly as it cooled. The adrenaline still buzzed in her veins, but there was also a deep sense of peace. When she climbed out of the cockpit, Eleanor was waiting for her, standing at the edge of the runway with a smile that stretched from ear to ear. Riley could see the tears in her eyes, the emotion written clearly on her face. "You did it," Eleanor said softly, her voice full of awe. "You brought him home." Riley nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She had flown the plane, but more than that, she had brought George's promise to life. She had completed the journey that began long before she ever set foot in the cockpit. "It's done," Riley said, her voice thick. "He's home." Eleanor walked toward her, tears still shining in her eyes, and embraced her. For a moment, the world felt still, as if time had slowed down to honor the moment. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered. "Thank you for giving him back to me." Riley didn't know what to say. Words didn't feel like enough for the weight of the moment. But as she stood there, with the plane gleaming in the distance and Eleanor's arms around her, She knew that this wasn't just about a plane or a pilot. It was about something much deeper. It was about honoring the past, remembering those who came before, and never forgetting the promises that shaped history. The days following the flight were a whirlwind. Riley couldn't remember the last time she had felt so fulfilled, so at peace with herself. The work was done. The plane had flown, and George's legacy had been honored. But it wasn't just about restoring a plane. It was about the journey, the connections she had made, the stories she had uncovered, and the lives that had intertwined in ways she never expected. Eleanor visited often after that day, sitting by the hangar, watching the plane glint in the sunlight, sometimes talking to it as though George could hear her. Riley was content to leave her to those moments of quiet reflection. Eleanor had waited so long for the closure, for the peace that had eluded her since George's disappearance. Now, she had it, and Riley was glad she could be a part of it. But there was still more work to do. Riley had always believed in fixing things that was her job, but what she didn't expect was that her journey with this fighter plane had started something inside her that she couldn't ignore. A desire to continue uncovering stories, to continue honoring legacies, to work on more projects that had deeper meaning. As she worked on other planes and cars in the shop, Riley couldn't shake the feeling that there was more for her to do. The restoration of George's plane had changed her perspective on the kind of work she wanted to pursue. She didn't just want to fix engines. She wanted to find stories, uncover the truths hidden in the past, and restore not only the metal and machinery, but the lives that had been impacted by them. One afternoon, as Riley was sanding the body of a vintage car, she received an unexpected call. It was from the same curator at the Aviation Museum, Tom, the one who had helped her track down the history of George's plane. "Riley, I've got something for you," Tom said, his voice crackling with excitement. "We've come across another piece of history, and I think you're the perfect person to restore it. It's a B-17 bomber that's been sitting in a field for years. We've been trying to get it into the right hands, and we think it should be yours." Riley's heart skipped a beat. A B-17 bomber? The magnitude of the request hit her like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just a single fighter. This was a piece of wartime history, a giant relic of the past that had been forgotten in the corner of a field. "I'll need more details," Riley said, her mind already racing with possibilities. "Where is it?" Tom gave her the location, and Riley made arrangements to see it the next day. She knew this was a big task, but she also knew she couldn't let it pass her by. After everything she had learned with George's plane, how could she walk away from another opportunity to restore a piece of history? The next morning, Riley drove to the site, the excitement building in her chest with every mile. When she arrived, she found the B-17, its massive frame stretched out across the field, half buried beneath weeds and earth. The plane was in bad shape, but the wings and tail were still intact, the body rusted but still standing tall. Riley walked around it, running her fingers along the rivets and worn surfaces, feeling the weight of the history that had been left behind. It wasn't just a project. It was another chance to restore something far greater than metal. It was an opportunity to bring history back to life, to honor the men who had flown it, to remember the legacy that had been lost in time. As she surveyed the B-17, Riley felt a sense of connection. She had started with a single fighter plane, a plane that had been forgotten by most, but carried with it a story of love and loss. Now, with this bomber, she felt like she was standing at the threshold of something even bigger. This wasn't just about restoring planes. It was about telling stories. It was about keeping the memories of those who had sacrificed everything alive. Over the next few weeks, Riley began work on the bomber. Every step felt monumental, from finding the right parts, to meticulously restoring the body, to researching the history of the crew that had once flown it. This wasn't just mechanical work. It was a restoration of history, of stories waiting to be told. As she worked, she realized that this was the beginning of something new for her. Her shop wasn't just a place to fix cars anymore. It had become a place where history lived, where the past met the present, and where stories were not only told but restored. She had found a new calling, one that was bigger than she could have imagined. And as she looked out over the field, at the B-17 taking shape under her hands, Riley knew that she was on the path to something extraordinary. It wasn't just about fixing engines. It was about giving people a chance to remember, to honor, and to never forget the sacrifices of the past. Her journey had only just begun. As the weeks passed, Riley's reputation as a restorer of historical aircraft grew, and soon, her shop became a haven for people who needed more than just a mechanic. They needed someone who understood the importance of memory, someone who could breathe life into something that had once been forgotten. The B-17 bomber became her new obsession, and with each passing day, she uncovered more than just rust and metal. She discovered pieces of history, moments frozen in time, and the stories of the brave men who had flown this very plane. The hangar, once a quiet space filled with the hum of engines and the scent of motor oil, was now alive with energy. Riley had assembled a small team of volunteers who came in after hours, eager to help her with the restoration. There was Leo, the young mechanic who had started out as a part-time helper in the shop and had since grown into a skilled and dedicated worker. Mrs. Avery, a retired schoolteacher, spent her afternoons polishing parts and offering wisdom from a life well lived. Even Father Kent, the local priest, had found a place among the rust and grease, lending his hands and heart to the cause. But it wasn't just the people who made the hangar feel alive. It was the stories. The B-17 wasn't just a piece of machinery. It was a time capsule, a living testament to the bravery of the men who had flown it. As Riley worked, she found old photos wedged between the panels of the plane, yellowed and tattered from years of neglect. She found handwritten notes from the crew members, scribbled on scraps of paper, telling jokes, sharing hopes, and documenting their fears. It was as though the plane had been waiting for someone to uncover its past, to give it a voice once more. One afternoon, as Riley carefully worked on the bomber's tail section, she found a small metal box hidden beneath a panel. Her heart skipped a beat as she pried it open, and inside, she found a stack of letters tied together with a fraying ribbon. They were addressed to a woman named Margaret. Riley's fingers trembled as she carefully opened the first letter, and her eyes scanned the handwritten words, dated October 1943. Margaret, my love, I don't know how much longer I can hold on to this promise, the letter began. Every day the war gets harder, but I know I have to keep fighting. I have to make it back to you. I promised I would. I'll return, Margaret, just like I promised. Riley's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just a letter. It was a love letter, written by one of the men who had flown this very bomber. She read through several more, each one filled with the same sense of longing and determination. The words in the letters were poignant, raw, and full of love, and they were written by a man who had been willing to risk everything for love, for duty, for the promise of a future. Riley sat back on her heels, the letters in her lap, and closed her eyes for a moment. The weight of what she had found sank in. These weren't just words on paper. They were the final thoughts of a man who had been lost to history, whose legacy had been carried in the hearts of those he left behind. And now, Riley held it all in her hands. As she sat there, lost in thought, Eleanor appeared in the doorway of the hangar, her eyes soft and filled with emotion. She had been a constant presence throughout Riley's journey, a guiding light, reminding her of the importance of what she was doing. Riley stood up and walked over to her, holding the letters in her hands. Eleanor, she said quietly, I found something. These letters, they're from a man who flew this plane, just like George did. Eleanor took the letters carefully, her hands trembling as she read the name, the handwriting, and the words of love and longing. I knew George wasn't the only one, Eleanor said softly, her voice catching. I knew there were others out there, others who wrote letters, others who made promises, but I never thought I'd find them. Riley smiled, her heart heavy with the weight of the discovery. There's more, Eleanor. There are more stories. There are more legacies. And we're going to make sure they're remembered. Every one of them. Eleanor nodded, wiping away a tear. You've done more than restore a plane, Riley. You've restored their memories. You've brought them back to life." The words hung in the air like a prayer, a promise. The B-17 wasn't just a machine anymore. It was a repository of stories, a home for the voices of the past. And Riley was the keeper of those stories, the one who would ensure that the men who had flown this plane and all those who had served would never be forgotten. As the restoration of the bomber continued, Riley's shop became more than just a place of work. It became a sanctuary for memory, a place where history was respected, where the past was honored, and where stories were given the chance to be told again. People came from all over to see the planes, to hear the stories, to touch the metal that had carried so much weight, not just in pounds, but in history. The B-17, with its new wings and polished frame, stood as a monument to the bravery of those who had served. And Riley, with the help of her friends and the memories of the men who had flown these planes, was making sure their stories would never fade. It wasn't just about restoring a plane anymore. It was about restoring a piece of the past, ensuring it lived on for future generations. Riley had found her true calling. And with every turn of the wrench, every layer of paint, and every word of remembrance, she was keeping the promise of those who had gone before her alive. As the final touches were added to the B-17 bomber, Riley felt the weight of history pressing in on her from all sides. The restoration had taken longer than she had anticipated, but every single moment had been worth it. The plane was more than just a historical relic. It had become a bridge between the past and the present. And now, it was time to give it back to the sky. But there was something else Riley needed to do. As the bomber took shape, she had become more and more fascinated with the crew members who had once flown it, the men who had made the ultimate sacrifice. She had spent countless hours researching the history of the bomber and the individuals who had served aboard it. What she had uncovered had moved her more than she could have imagined. One of the crew members, a young man named Arthur Art Williams, had been just 19 when he first flew on the B-17. He had written in his diary that he felt invincible, that the war was something he had to endure to prove himself. Riley could still see his face in the faded photograph. She had found a young man full of hope, standing proudly in front of the plane, smiling as though nothing in the world could touch him. But he had never made it home. Riley knew that the story of Art and the other crew members couldn't be left untold. The bomber, now almost complete, would fly once again. And Riley had decided that she wouldn't just fly it herself. She would honor every single soul who had flown it by ensuring that their stories were known. The day of the flight arrived, and the entire town gathered to witness the plane take to the skies once more. Riley stood at the edge of the runway, her heart racing with anticipation. She had been in planes before, but this was different. This wasn't just a routine flight. It was a celebration of life, of memory, of love and loss, and of the promise that had survived through decades of time. As the bomber roared to life, Riley felt a deep sense of connection to those who had once flown it. She was no longer just a mechanic. She was a keeper of stories, a protector of legacies. The men who had flown this plane were with her in that moment. She could feel their spirits, their hopes, and their sacrifices in every inch of the plane. And as the wheels left the ground and the bomber soared into the sky, Riley couldn't help but feel that they were finally home. The flight was smooth and steady, the plane gliding through the air with grace. Riley circled over the town, her eyes scanning the horizon, the wind in her hair, the roar of the engines filling her ears. It felt as though the entire town was watching from below, waiting to see what the sky would reveal. And then, as she flew higher, Riley made a turn toward the east, toward the place where Art and the others had flown, where their journey had begun and ended. She had a promise to keep. As the bomber approached the old cemetery on the edge of town, Riley brought it into a wide loop, the bomber's wings slicing through the sky like a knife through time. She slowed the plane and brought it to a gentle hover over the cemetery. Below her, she could see the rows of gravestones, the silent markers of the men who had given everything. Riley spoke into the intercom, her voice quiet but firm. "This flight is for you, Art. For all of you. You're not forgotten." She circled above the cemetery one more time, the plane cutting through the clouds, and for a moment, it felt like she was flying with the ghosts of the past. The B-17 was no longer just a machine. It was a vessel for memories, a carrier of souls who had lived and loved, fought and died. And as she flew higher, Riley knew she had done something more than just restore a plane. She had restored their memories, giving them a final flight, one last journey to honor their sacrifice. The bomber flew in a perfect arc, the sun catching the polished metal of its wings as it soared through the sky. Riley's heart swelled with pride, with sadness, with gratitude for the lives that had touched this aircraft. The plane was a living, breathing testament to those who had flown it. It was the embodiment of their courage, their bravery, their love. When Riley finally returned to the runway and landed the B-17, she didn't stop at the end of the tarmac. She slowly taxied the bomber to the small hangar where the crew members and volunteers were waiting. As the engines shut down, Riley sat in the cockpit for a long moment, the silence of the hangar filling the air around her. She felt like she had just crossed some invisible line between the past and the present, and when she climbed out of the cockpit, Eleanor was waiting for her, standing by the hangar with a smile that reached all the way to her eyes. "You did it," Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion. "You brought them home." Riley nodded, her eyes misty. "I didn't do it alone. We all did. This plane, these stories, they belong to all of us now." Eleanor stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Riley, pulling her into a warm embrace. "Thank you," she whispered, "for giving us this." As Riley held Eleanor, she realized that the journey she had started with the restoration of George's plane had led her to something greater than she could have ever imagined. It wasn't just about fixing planes or engines. It was about honoring the past, preserving memories, and ensuring that the stories of those who had given everything were never forgotten. Riley stood there, looking up at the B-17, now safely tucked away in the hangar. She had restored it, yes, but more than that, she had restored history. And in doing so, she had found a new sense of purpose, one that would carry her forward, one story at a time. Months had passed since the B-17 took to the sky, but Riley's life had changed in ways she never expected. The planes, the engines, the stories, they had all become part of her now. No longer just a mechanic working on machines, Riley had found her true calling as a keeper of history, a bridge between the past and present. And as her shop continued to thrive, so did her resolve to honor the stories of those who had come before her. Her work had drawn attention from local media and even national outlets. But it wasn't the fame that mattered to Riley. It was the connections she had made with the families, the veterans, and the communities that had been touched by the stories she uncovered. Each restoration project felt like a new chapter in a never-ending book, and every piece of history she brought back to life added to the legacy of those who had come before. One afternoon, as Riley sat in the hangar with a fresh cup of coffee, Leo came rushing in, a look of excitement on his face. "Riley, you've got to see this," he called, waving a piece of paper in the air. "It's a letter, an old one, from a museum in the Midwest. They want you to restore a P-51 Mustang they've just acquired. It's a legendary aircraft. Riley, one of the most famous fighters from World War II." Riley blinked in surprise, her heart quickening. The P-51 Mustang was one of the planes she had always admired, known for its speed and elegance. It had been a critical part of the war effort, and to have the chance to restore one was both an honor and a challenge she couldn't ignore. But before she could respond, Eleanor entered the hangar, her gentle smile, a familiar comfort. "I hear some big news?" she asked, looking between Riley and Leo. Riley stood, her mind buzzing with possibilities. "It's a P-51 Mustang. I'm being asked to restore it. I don't know how to say no to that." Eleanor nodded, a knowing glint in her eyes. "It's a big decision, I'm sure. But you've done more than restore planes, Riley. You've given people something priceless, their history. These planes are more than metal. They carry the spirits of those who flew them." Riley's heart swelled at Eleanor's words. They had become a team of sorts, bound by their shared understanding of history's weight and the importance of preserving it. She glanced back at the B-17, the one that had started everything, and then at the new challenges ahead. "I never thought it would come to this," Riley said quietly, running a hand through her hair. "When I started with George's plane, I thought I was just doing my job, but now, every plane feels like a living thing, like it carries the weight of all the lives that touched it." Eleanor reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. "That's because it does, Riley. It does." For a moment, there was silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Riley understood now. She wasn't just fixing machines. She was restoring legacies, keeping memories alive, and sharing those memories with the world. She was giving a voice to those who had been silenced by time, ensuring that their stories would live on, and that was a responsibility she would never take lightly. As Riley accepted the challenge to restore the P-51 Mustang, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Each new project was not just about getting another plane in the air. It was about honoring a promise made long ago, a promise to remember those who had fought and died for a future they would never see. The shop had become a sanctuary for these stories, a place where history could be touched, held, and shared. One evening, as Riley walked outside to watch the sun set over the hangar, she saw a young boy and his father standing by the fence, looking at the planes. The boy's eyes were wide with wonder, and Riley couldn't help but smile. She had seen this look before, an awe of something bigger than themselves, something that connected them to the past. The father looked up and nodded to her. "Is this your shop?" he asked. Riley nodded, wiping her hands on her jacket. "It is. I restore aircraft, mostly World War II fighters. Sometimes, they're more than just planes." The father smiled, then turned to the boy. "This one's going to be a pilot one day," he said, ruffling his son's hair. The boy grinned, clearly thrilled by the thought. Riley crouched down to meet the boy's eyes. "You want to be a pilot, huh? You know, these planes are more than just machines. They're a part of history. If you keep learning, keep dreaming, one day you might even fly one of these yourself." The boy's eyes lit up, and Riley knew that this moment, small as it was, meant something. Maybe one day, this young boy would take to the skies, just as the men before him had, with the weight of history beneath his wings. As she walked back to the hangar, Riley felt something deep within her settle. She had found her place in the world. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about sharing the stories that needed to be told, preserving the past for future generations, and ensuring that the people who had fought and sacrificed would never be forgotten. In the distance, the P-51 Mustang awaited its turn, but for now, Riley knew that whatever came next, she was ready. She was ready to restore more planes, to uncover more stories, and to keep flying forward, one history at a time. And as the sun set behind her, she smiled, knowing that the journey had only just begun.